مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في المدن والبلدات في جميع أنحاء بلادنا أحيا الأمريكيون الذكرى السنوية 20 للهجمات 11 من سبتمبر باحتفالات رسمية لتذكر الضحايا وتكريم الأبطال وتكرار الوعود بمنع الإرهابيين من مهاجمتنا في وطننا مرة أخرى. في الوقت نفسه وبعد القرار الأكثر أهمية فيما يتعلق بالسياسة الخارجية الذي اتخذته إدارة بايدن، أحيت طالبان هذه الذكرى السنوية عبر الاحتفال بعودتها إلى السلطة في أفغانستان. ماذا يعني الانسحاب من أفغانستان بالنسبة إلى خطر الإرهاب؟ هل يمكننا محاربة الإرهابيين بدون قواعد عسكرية موجودة على بعد مئات الأميال من كابول؟ إذا كان هناك من منطق للانسحاب من أفغانستان، فهل يؤكل أيضا إبقاء القوات الأمريكية في العراق؟ لمناقشة مسألة الأمن القومي الأمريكي في إعقاب الانسحاب من أفغانستان، يسعدني أن أرحب بأحد أهم المفكرين الاستراتيجيين والقادة العسكريين في أمريكا، الجنرال ديفيد بيترياس. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Afghanistan, Kabul, Iraq, Baghdad, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, the right role for American generals in American political life. These are all the issues on our headlines, and these are the issues that we're going to discuss today with General David Petraeus. General Petraeus, thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of Dakhel Washington.
Great to be with you, Rob. Pardon the little cosmetic addition here, but no big deal.
So let's jump right into it, General. Withdrawing from Afghanistan, there seem to be three camps: the right policy implemented poorly, and the wrong policy. What do you think?
Well, I thought that there were alternatives. I did put forward an alternative publicly. I've done it for a number of years. That could have been described as a sustainable commitment, and sustainability is measured in the expenditure of blood and treasure. The U.S. had not had a single battlefield loss in 18 months, and the cost was very, very reduced because our forces were less than 3,500, even though we certainly still funded the Afghan security forces and a good bit of the government expenditures. But again, considering the alternative, the Taliban rule versus a, however imperfect, however in parts corrupt, maddening Afghan government, the alternative seemed to me to be preferable. The decision went the other way, obviously. And then I don't think there is anyone who would hold out the withdrawal as having gone remotely smoothly. Clearly, there was a complete underappreciation, an inability to appreciate the enormous psychological effect, first of the Trump administration agreement that forced the Afghan government to release 5,000 Taliban detainees, excluded the Afghan government from the actual negotiating table, and got the Taliban to agree with us leaving. And so you already had that particular blow struck. The new administration came in, did not reverse that decision, unlike its reversal of the withdrawal from the World Health Organization or from the Paris Climate Accord or Somalia or some other issues. They went ahead with it, in fact, accelerated it. And you had a situation where there was, again, a failure to appreciate the psychological effect on the Afghan security forces of the withdrawal, not just of U.S. forces and above all our air power, all the coalition forces who couldn't stay without the U.S., and then the 18,000 contractors who maintained the sophisticated U.S. provided helicopters and planes, which were critical for government forces that are spread all around the country. They have to defend the bulk of the country. The Taliban could mass against those different locations. They did so very skillfully, simultaneously, And over time, the Afghan Air Force could no longer respond with reinforcements, emergency resupply, aerial medevac, and close air support. The Afghan forces recognized that, and despite having died at a rate of 27 to 1 to U.S. casualties previously, 66,000 or so Afghans killed, most in the past decade alone. In this case, they laid down their weapons together with the political leaders of the districts and provinces, and you saw the Taliban move very rapidly to Kabul. And by the way, breaking all of their fighters and the Islamic State fighters, I might add, out of prison at the same time the Afghan government collapsed. And you have this terrible situation where the U.S. military is gone. We only had a contingent protecting, securing the U.S. embassy, and yet we still have our diplomats, large numbers of U.S. citizens and green card holders, many tens of thousands of special immigrant visa holders and applicants, those that spent 2 or more years on the ground with our men and women in uniform, sharing risk and hardship, qualifying to come to the United States with their family members, with their lives in jeopardy, and then many others also in jeopardy because of their actions for the U.S. Embassy, for the Afghan government, or for a variety of other international and national causes. So, of course, what you saw then was, in some respects, a logistical marvel, not all on U.S. planes, but 120 some odd thousand people pulled out in a very short period of time, but also a chaotic scene, which tragically then also was exploited by the Islamic State Khorasan group, the group that operates in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, detonating a suicide bomb that killed 13 of our young men and women in uniform and over 180 innocent Afghan civilians. So again, very much a chaotic withdrawal, and a withdrawal, candidly, an evacuation that still is not fully complete. There's still small numbers of U.S. citizens, green card holders, but very substantial numbers of special immigrant visa applicants and their family members, and then many, many others whose lives are in jeopardy and who are being sought by the Taliban because of the actions that they took supporting either the U.S. coalition or Afghan government efforts.
There's somewhat of a debate as to whether the Taliban in 2021 is the same Taliban that was there in 2001, that whether it has mellowed internally or whether it has taken a different view of the wisdom of hosting groups like Al-Qaeda. After all, some say the last thing the Taliban wants is to invite another American invasion after they saw what happened the last time. What's your view of this issue? What is the Taliban 2021 all about?
Well, still to be determined, Rob, as you would understand. They've literally just recently formed the government. That formation is not all that encouraging. I think it's at least a third of the members of the government have some kind of sanction against them. The Minister of Interior has a $5 or $10 million bounty on his head. He's the head of the Haqqani network, a very murderous element and ally of the Taliban, albeit, again, a domestic Afghan rather than an international extremist organization. Still to be determined what the relationship will be between Al-Qaeda, a traditional ally, if you will, or at least a friend to some degree with the Taliban over the years. Remember that when the 9/11 attacks were planned in Afghanistan, it was the Taliban that controlled the country at the time, and the Taliban refused an ultimatum to remove them from Afghan territory, which is what required us to go in, topple the Taliban, and eliminate that sanctuary, and of course to stay ever since to ensure that they could not reestablish it, something they, as you know, they have tried to do repeatedly, including when I was the commander on Central Command, the commander on the ground in Afghanistan, and the CIA director. You see the Islamic State Khorasan group, that's an enemy of the Taliban that has been fighting them almost like a resistance movement, carrying out attacks, particularly in the eastern part of the country, in addition to that terrible attack that took place in Kabul. Other resistance elements, very modest in size so far, but we'll see how that evolves, because what we're going to see is a true humanitarian catastrophe. Now, the Taliban presented themselves initially the viewers will recall, with quite a sophisticated public relations campaign, although the four guys with AK-47 standing before them perhaps might not have been the backdrop that they should have chosen. He said that they would indeed be different from the Taliban that ruled the country as if it was in the 7th century under a very extreme interpretation of Sharia law. What we're seeing is a mix. We've already seen that the new individual who's in charge of the higher education has said that women will not be allowed to go to college. It does not appear that they're going to be able to go beyond the 7th grade. Women have not been asked to return to their job. In fact, they've been told to stay home if they had jobs in government, unless they were only capable of being performed by women, such as women attendants at women bathrooms or something like that. We've seen summary executions. We have seen the pursuit of individuals that supposedly the Taliban was going to reconcile with and instead have been pursuing because of their activities with the previous government. So I think still very much in question right now. And I think what maybe even more important than perhaps how draconian this will be, and I think it will be, I think we're going to see maybe not the 7th century interpretation of Sharia law, but something that is vastly more ultra conservative than is probably in place anywhere else around the world. But what we are definitely going to see, tragically, is a humanitarian catastrophe. I think the Taliban are already realizing that it's a lot easier to be the, if you will, the opposition party on the backbench, you know, throwing criticism and epithets and improvised explosive devices and rockets at the ruling party than it is to be the government because they are broke financially. Their assets have been frozen around the world, such as they are. IMF special drawing rights have been put on hold, same with World Bank assistance. There's no sign that China is going to come in and bail them out. And keep in mind that it was the United States, together with some other major donor countries like Japan, UK, and others, that funded 75% of the budget of the Afghan government, which relies on the Central Asian states for electricity being pumped into their country, Iran for refined fuel products to augment that, and also, of course, for transportation. A lot of the foodstuffs are imported. They run a massive trade deficit. And of course, they are literally going to run out of money, and certainly especially out of hard currency very, very quickly. So you're seeing already real deprivation. There was a drought this summer. The harvest was very poor. And then a collapse of the economy, as you know, all the international organizations, or many of them, embassies have shut down, all the international workers, the contractors, all of this have gone home, been evacuated, or trying to get out. A brain drain. The internal investors, of course, that had money and had visas and so forth, left earlier on. And of course, certainly no one who's going to do what we did, which is pay 300,000 security force members' salaries, operating expenses, training, equipping, and all the rest of that. So I think you're going to see a real disaster. I think it has enormous implications, particularly for the surrounding states, and especially, needless to say, Pakistan, which has already seen many refugees trying to flood into its country. I suspect we'll see on the order of at least over 1 million, if not more. The only restriction will just be, you know, being able to get through the various Khyber Pass and the other crossing points that are available to them, because there is going to be true desperation, and nothing the Taliban can do can make this up. All they bring to the table are the proceeds of the illegal narcotics trade, which they have always controlled, and that is by no means going to make up a difference of what could be as much as 12 to 15 billion dollars that they will not have as a result of all these other sources of assistance, both from donor nations and from international financial organizations.
When we come back after the break with General Petraeus, we're going to talk about the difference of the lessons between counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, and we're going to flow over into a country of closer immediacy to many of our viewers, what this all means for Iraq, in just a moment. Again, our guest today is General David Petraeus, Few Americans are as synonymous with the term national security, and few military officers have played as significant a role in our nation's deliberation about our place in the world as our guest today. General Petraeus served for 37 years in the United States Army, rising to be a four-star general. And unless your name is Eisenhower, it doesn't get any higher than that. He had the unique distinction of serving as commander of U.S. and coalition forces in Iraq, commander of U.S. forces and coalition forces in Afghanistan, and as commander of all U.S. forces in the Middle East, what is known as Central Command, or CENTCOM. Then he took off his uniform, put on a suit, and served his nation as Director of Central Intelligence in the Obama administration. All right, General Petraeus, when President Biden described the withdrawal from Afghanistan, he said that he was putting an end to the idea of counterinsurgency, focusing America instead on the narrower task of counterterrorism. What does that mean to you?
Well, counterinsurgency is a very comprehensive civil military campaign that does include operations by counterterrorist forces. So you have your very high-end Delta, SEAL Team 6, these kinds of forces who are going after the leaders of the terrorist organizations and insurgent groups that are making life difficult for a country. But the counterinsurgency campaign has to include much more than that. As we actually learned in Iraq, where we tried to just take down all the leaders, it's not enough to take out the leaders of these organizations. We pounded away in Ramadi for several years before we realized that you have to actually clear and hold and rebuild areas. So you have to conduct conventional military clearance operations, usually with host nation forces along with you in a coalition. You then have to hold them. And then the way that once you have established security is by performing other tasks, by restoring basic services, by rebuilding damaged infrastructure, by helping to reestablish local grievance mechanisms and governance, by restoring the host nation, working with them to restore the rule of law, all the rest of this, because the security foundation that is established by the counterterrorism operations and the larger, again, conventional clearance operations and hold, those have to be solidified by these other activities. That's how you get the people at the end of the day supporting first your forces and then the host nation government and its forces. That did, in fact, work almost like a textbook during the surge in Iraq. And in fact, it continued to work for a good 3.5 years after that, even as we drew down our forces, and unfortunately was undone by highly sectarian actions taken by the government in the wake of our withdrawal that then took the eye of Iraqi security forces off what by then was called the Islamic State. It was able to reconstitute and, of course, establish the caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria, and the U.S. had to come back in to help Iraqi and Syrian democratic forces eliminate that caliphate. But in this case, we did it by providing advice, assistance, and enablers, not by doing the operations themselves, not by being on the front lines. And that's a huge change made possible by the enormous proliferation of drones, precision close air support, and intelligence fusion. But to come back to the issue, if there are Islamist extremists anywhere in the world, one lesson we should have learned, at least from the last 20 years, is that you have to keep an eye and pressure on them. Now, ideally, we want to do that through host nation forces in support of them. Again, advising, assisting, training, equipping, and enabling, but them doing it on the front lines. By the way, that's what was happening in Afghanistan even, albeit there you're going against insurgents, not just extremists like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. But of course, the insurgents allow the space within which terrorists can operate. What's very important to recognize is that if you only do counterterrorism operations, what you are doing only is disrupting and degrading. You are not eliminating the causes of that give rise to extremism, to terrorism. And so it takes the more comprehensive approach that I've just described that we did employ in the surge in Iraq. Ambassador Crocker, myself, Prime Minister Maliki, and the Iraqi government and forces. That was a very comprehensive effort. And by and large, it did largely reduce the causes that used to exist prior to our departure at least, for the feeling of the Sunni being cast off, alienated, no longer part of the new Iraq, and not even having a stake in the success in the new Iraq, but having a stake in its failure. The fabric of society was brought back together for a period of time, tragically torn apart by these highly sectarian actions taken right after our withdrawal. But nonetheless, you get the idea, the comprehensive nature of a counterinsurgency campaign. But now we want to do it without us doing all of the frontline fighting, restoration of basic services, reconciliation, repair of damaged infrastructure, and the rest. And that's the intent. It's a good intent. It's what the Biden administration, I think, commendably is doing.
Am I reading too much into your remarks by noting a certain tone of skepticism about what is called over-the-horizon counterterrorism, being able to effectively disrupt and prevent terrorism from afar?
Well, the director of the CIA, the great Ambassador Bill Burns, has been very forthright, as have the military commander, General McKenzie, and others, the current Central Command commander, in noting that it will be much tougher. Again, we have no bases now whatsoever in not just in Afghanistan, but in the Central Asian states and also in South Asia. We have no bases in Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan anymore. So all of this will have to be done from bases, if it involves drones at the least, in, say, the United Arab Emirates, in Qatar, and they'll use 60% of their flight time just getting to and from Afghanistan. So a much, much tougher task. And of course, none of the bases for our intelligence assets, such as we were privileged to have when I was the director of the CIA, none of the surrogate forces, and certainly not in the numbers, the human intelligence networks that we had, very, very difficult to facilitate all of that from countries in which we do not have substantial bases. It is not impossible. It will take a lot of creativity. There are new technologies that we will use very extensively, linked to, everyone has a digital footprint in cyberspace and in the virtual world and so forth. But it will take a great deal of challenge. And indeed, you have to be aware of the shortcomings of looking at the world through a soda straw. And tragically, we saw that with the mistaken drone strike in Afghanistan in the final days of the evacuation of our citizens and others from Kabul airport.
So whatever we think about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, just to be clear, you think staying in Iraq is the right idea?
I very much do, but doing it in a way that is compatible with the Iraqi government, ensuring that it is, in a sense, politically acceptable. We know very clearly the sensitivities of U.S. forces on Iraqi soil. Obviously, we know the concerns of neighbors that would love to Lebanonize Iraq, in other words, to use militias that they support and control, and political parties and so forth, to gain the kind of control that they have in Lebanon. But again, our presence is there to help them with security tasks, to keep an eye on the Islamic State, some continued training and equipping, professionalization. And I think all of that is very welcome by the Iraqi government and security forces, as is the NATO contingent that is going to expand modestly there as well.
Excellent. Well, that concludes our first episode of this special series with General David Petraeus. We'll be back next week with more. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الاحتفالات الاستراتيجية بين أفغانستان والعراق، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.